In 2019, Hong Kong erupted with a wave of protests sparked by the proposal of extradition laws that would give mainland China greater juridical power over the city. Hong Kongers organized the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill movement, or anti-ELAB, that poured into every corner of the city. The protests, predominantly street protests, extended beyond the common understanding of the streets. The malleability of the streets and the urban landscape of Hong Kong allowed protesters to construct sites of protest around it and subsequently utilize urban structures in the movement. The streets remained the core of the series of demonstrations, both for its functional and symbolic meanings. The anti-ELAB movement began with two unprecedented demonstrations of people power in the streets in June 2019, which were attended by 1 million and 2 million people, respectively. The role of the streets is crucial in their making. The streets mobilize in tandem with the people as they melt together into a unified body of protest for the soul of Hong Kong, for the very life of the city. How do the streets of Hong Kong contribute and amplify the protest movement? The streets and places of public are not traditionally regarded as locations of identity-making. French anthropologist Marc Aug argues that supermodernity produces non-spaces, supermarkets, hospitals, transitional places of public transportation. These non-spaces are not anthropological as people move through them without assuming a distinct identity, blending in with the mass. The anti-ELAB protest sites are anything but. While protesters may remain faceless and nameless as they flood the streets, they certainly are not an aimless mass. The tactic of the protests has been described as the water movement, inspired by Taoist philosophy. To be water is to be without shape or form, flexible and free to flow over obstacles. It is also to be connected as a constantly moving body, playing off the environment in which it exists. The urbanscape of Hong Kong in the current turbulent climate is what French philosopher Bruno Latour would call a critical zone, where humans and non-human actors engage in complex relationships and together shape the intricacy of history, crisis, conflicts, and transformations. The critical zone allows the understanding of how both natural and social elements intertwine to foster a unified system, much like Hong Kong, the city, its history, people, and social conditions. Hong Kong people do not simply be on the streets, but live, experience, form social connections, and create cultural significance there. The streets, then, are not simply locations, but a critical physical and cultural space. American cultural geologist David Craft recognizes this as the embodiment of the streets. In one understanding of embodiment, people embody the streets as part of their identity. Contrary to Aug's idea, Craft argues that humans create rather than abandon their identity on the streets. Traveling through streets and buildings in our daily lives is a ritual where we get more and more familiar with them and inscribe them with special meanings. On Sunday, June 16, 2019, Hong Kong saw its largest and most powerful march in history yet. The pro-democracy Civil Human Rights Front estimates that 2 million people took to the street to protest the passing of the bill. Out of Hong Kong's population of 7.5 million people, the sheer number of attendees spoke of the city's overwhelming unity and sentiment. The crowd follows the well-worn path on Hong Kong Island, starting from Victoria Park, pouring down the roads through the MTR stations of Causeway Bay and Wan Chai, and ending at Admiralty, where the Legislative Council is situated. Many insist on starting the march all the way from Victoria Park, which holds a tremendous significance as the site of the annual vigil and commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Similarly, other sites also simmer with their history as stages of political and protest rituals. The Hong Kong Exhibition and Convention Center and the Golden Bauhinia Square in the Wan Chai MTR area witnessed the 1997 handover ceremony and numerous China's holiday flag-raising ceremonies. These locations thus become spots where the political rhetoric of one country, two systems is strongly contested. In this sense, the protest route on Hong Kong Island, through Victoria Park, the Hong Kong Exhibition Center, the Golden Bohemia Square, or the Legislative Council Complex is a manifestation of Latour's critical zones. The zones are not controlled by the action of a single actor, or even a vast number of human actors. Moving away from the perspective of the human acting on nature, one recognizes that humans, streets, and buildings alike are actors capable of shaping one another to form new narratives. Millions of Hong Kongers in the anti-ELAB movement marched not only on concrete streets, but lanes of history and memory of Hong Kong's resistance up until that moment. In turn, every protest and march adds yet another layer to these iconic streets and buildings, making them a rich foundation for future movements. The march of 2 million people is historic yet unsurprising. Protest on the streets has become more than a political means. As Anthony Dapron has put it, and by taking to the streets, they were expressing their dissatisfaction by exercising one of those key rights and freedom. I am a Hong Konger, therefore I protest. Protest became a performance of Hong Kong identity. Even though the traditionally public non-spaces, such as the streets, are rarely identity-making, they become one when people decide to take their matters to the streets. When individuals protest in the streets, they take on a collective identity as the people of the city. The work of British geographer Gillian Rose has sketched that identifying with a place can occur at different scales or levels. While a sense of identity is often associated with domestic or personal spaces, it can also be located at a regional or national scale. At these levels, the landscape plays a key role. People develop a sense of belonging and identity through large and undifferentiated space through which they could move. On a larger scale, they imagine nations through particular places which appear to embody the values that the particular nation prizes. The streets of Hong Kong are effective in creating this identity by demonstrating visually the number of people who stand together for the same cause, which was extremely crucial in creating momentum at the beginning of the anti-ELAB movement. The landscape of Hong Kong and the people's ability to march freely demonstrate the core values of freedom they believe set Hong Kong apart from other parts of China: freedom of speech, of democratic processes, and of determining their ways of life. As the protests developed, apart from being a functional space for the creation of this common identity, the streets became more symbolic. Even when it became more and more difficult for demonstrators to obtain approval for public assemblies and demonstrations from the police, protests in the streets did not stop. The mere act of protesting in the streets was an act of protest against the limitation of freedom. Clashes between the protesters and the police were frequent. The power of the protesters was definitely much less than that of the police, but what mattered was that it was a manifestation of the people versus the regime. The difficulty for there to be an organized protest gave rise to the be-water nature of the 2019 protests. Urban structures and geographical knowledge of the city became crucial to the effectiveness of these protests. Telegram channels pool together information of the ever-changing situations in the streets where the police are, where barricades are built, where tear gas is released, and so on. Protesters even created a web page that located the protesters and the police on an interactive map. The way Hong Kong protesters rely on the structure of the streets and the city also speaks of another level of embodiment. Going beyond embodiment as mentally embracing meanings, Crouch argues for the effectivity of the streets on the corporeal human bodies. The body reads the spaces and the surrounding action of events, making sense of where it is, in an encompassing sense of culture, social relations and space, movement and artifacts, imagination and metaphor. Crouch argues from a perspective of embodied cognition, which is a paradigm shift away from standard cognitive science. Thinkers of embodied cognition reason that human perception is not just a process of the brain, but also the body. Perception is determined by what our bodies are capable of, and thus perceiving is a kind of skillful bodily activity. Furthermore, human meaning is embodied at all levels, as the core of conceptualization, and reasoning is rooted in the way bodies move within and interact with environments. Indeed, The anti-ELAB protests took place inside various urban structures, such as shopping malls and the airport. The protesters made use of their symbolic meaning as the manifestation of Hong Kong's status of an important financial hotspot, certainly. But the protesters also adapted to the physicality of these structures to organize meaningful activities. Large lobbies of the malls became makeshift squares as people centered around them, flocked to multiple balconies several stories high that surround the lobbies. The lobbies were consumerist attractions no more, but echo chambers were the Hong Kong anthem, and pro-democratic slogans were sung and chanted by hundreds of people. Quite literally, the conviction of the anti-ELAB movement is amplified through the human bodies and their senses. Protesters angle their bodies towards the sounding songs and slogans, their eyes taking in the gathering sight, their ears listening, their skins pressed against others. The urban structure thus gives rise to a sensation and conception of unity, freedom, and patriotism. Such a phenomenon also takes place on the streets. On days when authorizations for protest were denied, protesters, who were just pedestrians a moment ago, would swarm the roads with numbers. Others can just join in the procession when the crowd arrives. One can move in and out of the identity of a protester fluidly. Lenin walls were another form of protest that first emerged in the umbrella movement of 2014 and re-emerged in the anti-ELAB movement. There was always a Lenin wall close to where you live, whether in a tunnel, on the wall of an overhead bridge, or a particular empty wall in the area. With the construction of these Lenin walls, these previously unnoticeable public non-spaces become an identifiable location. People could put up posters or sticky notes there, essentially utilizing the space for communication with others. It is true, as Crouch argues, we create meanings on the streets with a profound sense of physical awareness, as we observe, move, and feel a complexity of surface, vibration, shape, form. He aptly states that the bodies in space are never inactive. They take in messages from their surroundings, perceive meanings, but also go on to reshape them, and pass them on to others by reconstructing the environment. Latour himself wondered if there can be such a term as critical zonists, but it would be apt to call Hong Kongers so. They engage with critical zones not with a distant gaze, but through being from within, themselves part and parcel of the zone in which they intervene. The identity of Hong Kong cannot be reduced to a single human or generation, and it cannot be separated from the urbanscape of this vibrant yet turbulent city. The streets of Hong Kong remain a critical zone that will witness waves of effect from powerful movements like anti-ELAB. The future of Hong Kong remains an open question. However, the city and its people will certainly influence the course of history making.